Welcome, everyone. I'm Batul Mirza, and I'm here with Autism Empowered channel. You're watching Kiran Krishnan, someone I've deeply admired for a really long time. He is a microbiologist, a researcher, and co-founder of Microbiome Labs. Anyone who knows me knows how much and how deeply I regard the products of Microbiome Labs, and I use them in my practice as well. So I'm really delighted to be hosting Kiran here today. And the topic that we're discussing today is going to be autism and microbiome, because we know that microbiome plays a huge role in the recovery and the health and immunity and development of children on the autism spectrum. Kiran was kind enough to agree and make time for us. So I have put together a huge list of questions. Kiran, I hope I don't bore you. I will hand it over to you to just briefly introduce yourself. We know who you are, but just in case I missed something.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a very important and relevant topic to be talking about because to me, spectrum disorders is just another example of our lack of managing and harboring the microbiome that is so important to us as humans, as a species. Right, and these are microbes that were passed down from generation to generation through lots of trials and tribulations that our ancestors have gone through, and we really should be stewards of this amazing ecosystem that affords us all this functionality. And when we're not, and we squander it and a lot of it inadvertently, we don't even know we're doing things that are harmful to the microbiome. But when we do damage it and squander it, it shows up in many clinical symptoms and clinical conditions. Spectrum disorders seems to be one of those, and the prevalence rate of spectrum disorders increasing so significantly over the last few decades is another, to me, red herring that there's a significant amount of dysbiosis and dysfunction in our microbiome happening from generation to generation, right? Hence, these conditions and these issues will only get worse unless we stop it and reverse it and make a significant change. So it's my pleasure to be able to play a role in that understanding, and then also in the solutions on how you make a change.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, thank you for that. And you raised some really valuable points there. One of the burning questions that I get from the autism community, and I coach a lot of autism parents or families with kids on the autism spectrum, is the understanding that from a young age, we have been exposed to overuse of antibiotics. In the case of my own son, he had back-to-back ear infections, and we would treat it with antibiotics. And if they don't go away, you would repeat it, strep, multiple other things. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know I've heard you talk about it as well, that these add insults to the system as well. And we have overuse of antibiotics. We've got children being born through C-section, not being able to get the mother's microbiome as well through that process. They've already been given a very delayed start, and now they have all this to deal with, which makes them even more vulnerable. Is there hope for them? I mean, of course there is, but what does the recovery process look like after years of overuse of antibiotics and having a bad start?
Yeah, the good news there is that because we're dealing with an ecosystem, and the impact of things like antibiotics and poor diet, so ultra processed foods, and the consumption of things like pesticides and herbicides, the ultra sterile environments that we live in, all of these types of things, the stress in itself is a huge driver of dysbiosis. All of those things alter the microbiome and the ecosystem in a way that can be clinically profound, but it doesn't mean that you've wiped out beneficial bacteria, right? You've altered the balance quite a bit. And so you have everyone has certain pathogenic organisms within their microbiome. That's a normal aspect of it. And pathogenic and dysfunctional, what we may consider dysfunctional microbes, can actually be important and functional when they're under control and at certain levels. And then you've got all these amazing commensal microbes that control them. But when we do things like take antibiotics and all that alter the balance, what you end up getting is a higher representation of the dysfunctional microbes and their functionality, right? But these microbes, the good microbes, aren't necessarily gone. They're just at such low levels that their functionality is not being realized. Like, a simple example of that are short chain fatty acid producing bacteria. Right? We all in a healthy state should have multiple species within our gut that produce short chain fatty acids for us by taking carbohydrates or fiber really and prebiotics and converting it to short chain fatty acids. Now, let's say we've had a poor diet. We eat a bunch of processed foods for months on end. We have a course or two of antibiotics. We over-sterilize. We have a lot of stress. We have a lack of motion and movement and exercise and all that. All of that will start reducing the amount of short chain fatty acid producing bacteria and increase bacteria that conduct something called proteolytic fermentation. So they're not producing short chain fatty acids, they're producing more inflammatory compounds like P-cresol or ammonia and so on. So now your whole system has shifted. You will experience that with very profound symptomology, but it doesn't mean that these good bacteria are not there anymore. It becomes then a strategic approach of rebalancing the system to bring back the short chain fatty acid bacteria. And then they will do what they're meant to do by nature. And then you'll feel all of the added benefits and effects of those, right? So that's a very important thing that people need to understand, that you can always make a positive change in your ecosystem. It's never too late. Right. It doesn't matter if you're talking about your child. It doesn't matter if your child is now, 12 or 13 or 14 years old and has been through multiple rounds of antibiotics, was C-section, was, not breastfed, all of these things. And then you're like, oh my God, it's too late. No, it's not. You can always make a positive change. Those beneficial bacteria are there for the most part. You just have to increase their growth. And it doesn't matter if you're 90 years old and you've had decades of poor choices and behaviors, you could still make a change. So there's always hope, and you just have to know what to do.
Yeah, so I think the point you're trying to make is that there is an ecosystem, but it has lost its balance, and you can reinstate balance. But it brings me to my question: what are the key factors that may be involved in balancing our gut again? I know probiotics is one way, but you have deep research in microbiome. I know foods play a huge role.
They do, yeah. So foods can be one of the most important drivers of ecological change in the gut microbiome. So let's talk first about what are the negative changes that occur in a dysfunctional gut, and then of course how do you reverse those, right? So one of the biggest global factors in a dysfunctional gut that you see in spectrum disorders, in virtually every chronic disease there is, and so on, is a loss of diversity. And a loss of diversity means you've reduced dramatically the number of functional species within your gut microbiome. You don't need to have completely lost those species, meaning they're gone from the ecosystem. What you need to have lost is their functionality, right? And so their numbers are so low that they can't compete with the other microbes, so they don't conduct the functions they're supposed to conduct. So loss of diversity is a very important thing that occurs. You also start then, as a result of losing diversity, you start to get an overabundance of pathobionts. So these are pathogenic or opportunistic microbes. So these are microbes that have pathogenic capability, but don't exercise that capability until their numbers swell to a certain level, right? And so when their numbers are under control, they're not necessarily creating any issues. But when they're allowed to overgrow, they will start producing toxins and toxigenic elements and so on. So these are microbes like Clostridia, certain types of Clostridia, Disolvo vibrio, or Bilophila, Wadsworthia, or Enterococcus. So these are present in everyone's gut to some degree or the other, but they're overgrown in people with dysbiosis. As a result of this kind of change, you will also end up with intestinal permeability. And as a result of intestinal permeability or leaky gut, you start to get a lot of endotoxins, LPS, which are a toxin that's produced by about 40 or 50% of the microbes in your microbiome. So it's constantly being produced in the lining of the gut. If your gut is leaky, it leaks through into circulation. About 80% of it, 85% of it goes to the liver. The liver undergoes a lot of toxicity in trying to control and neutralize this toxin. As a result, the liver produces less bile and becomes more dysfunctional. And because it produces less bile, it has less control over controlling the microbiome. So then the microbiome gets even more dysbiotic, the liver gets even more targeted and toxigenic, bile production lowers even more, and the gut becomes even more dysbiotic, and it becomes a continuous cycle. Right. And then as a result of the changes in the microbiome, you also get a significant change in metabolites that the microbiome produces. So you have to think of your microbiome as a critically important nutrient factory, right? There's a lot of nutrients that we need to function, like basic functionality as humans, that we cannot get from food or we cannot make ourselves. And the only place these come from so far that have been identified are the microbes in the microbiome. So the microbes will metabolize food sources coming in and will convert them into very useful metabolites that we need. Now, when your microbiome is off and the balance is off, then you start getting higher levels of inflammatory and toxigenic metabolites like P-cresol and ammonia and 4-EPS and certain types of propionic acid and so on, versus the beneficial stuff like urolithins, butyrate, acetate, and so on, right? So now the metabolites are off. As a result of the metabolites being off, then your immune system becomes off, your metabolic system becomes off, your gut-brain axis starts to suffer. You start getting emotional issues, anxiety, depression, and all kinds of things. So this is how some of these things start to cascade. And then finally, you get a lot of inflammation as a result of this, right? A lot of inflammation in the lining of the gut, a lot of inflammation in the liver, and then you also end up with systemic low-grade inflammation. So now all organ systems start to suffer as a result of this, right? So these are the things people need to think about as in terms of what is going wrong in the gut. Low diversity, higher levels of pathogens. As part of that low diversity, you also start to reduce keystone species. And these are really commensal bacteria that help manage the rest of the population, and they are inversely correlated with disease, meaning the higher their levels are, for the most part, the more protected you are against a lot of chronic conditions, right? So keystone strains go up, and then as a result, you get intestinal permeability, liver dysfunction, gallbladder dysfunction, systemic inflammation, and so on. So those are the problems that occur, right? And it's important to think about that. So then you go, okay, how do we address these things? Because the first thing that occurred in this entire cascade, and which is why I went through and explained the whole cascade, was it's important to understand the upstream and downstream effects, right? So the most upstream driver of this entire cascade I explained was a change in the microbiome, a dysbiotic change, meaning lower commensals, lower keystone species, lower diversity, and then higher pathobionts as a result, right? So that then becomes the first thing everybody should be tackling, right? You might have symptoms, right? Because your liver might be dysfunctional now, your gut-brain axis may be dysfunctional, you might have an overgrowth of H. pylori, you might have fungal overgrowth. All of these other things are secondary to the first thing that went wrong, which is that functional change in the microbiome. So the first thing everybody needs to go after is to increase diversity, right? And we'll talk about how you do that. Increase keystone species. And as a result of doing those two things, you'll automatically bring down the pathogens and pathobionts, because the good bacteria will compete with the bad bacteria, right? So those are the first two things to do, just to organize it for people so they don't get overwhelmed and go, oh my God, I have to do so many things. So that's the easy part, right? So increase diversity, increase keystone species. So how do you do that? Number one, diet has a huge impact on the diversity of your microbiome. Any sort of restrictive diets, right? If you're on keto or paleo or, like any of those restrictive diets, you've eliminated all this FODMAPs, all this stuff. People just cut stuff off, cut stuff out of their system and their diets, and they're eating like 7 things. Any sort of restricted diet beyond a couple of months are going to drive lower diversity. Right? So we need to feed our microbiome a highly diverse diet, like our ancestors did. The evolution of our microbiome is as a result of high diversity in food consumption by our species, right? There are anthropological studies that estimate that early humans ate up to 600 different types of foods annually, right? We eat everything. We're omnivores. We eat meats and nuts and roots and tubers and seeds and fruits and everything. We'll eat insects if we have to, right? We eat the parts of the world, people eat the innards of animals, and they eat all kinds of things. So humans are omnivores, and we're designed to eat a large variety of things. The more of those varieties that are in the plant-based areas, the better, because most of the microbes in your gut do really well with plant-based material, right? So polyphenols, carotenoids, fiber, both soluble and insoluble fiber, and so on, all of those things that are found in plant-based foods tend to feed a higher diversity of microbes. Now, it's also pretty clear that our bodies have been designed to work with these kind of plant-based foods to function in a normal way. Like one area of example of that is the fact that we've got bitter receptors all throughout our digestive tract, right? Starting in our mouth, in our stomach, in our intestines, even in our gallbladder, in our liver, all these other areas. Now, bitters, where do they come from? Bitters all come from plants. Right. And so they come from fruits and berries and roots and tubers and seeds and nuts and all that. And when you bind these bitter receptors with bitter compounds that are found in plant-based foods, it stimulates both the movement of the bowel, it stimulates satiety signaling, it stimulates metabolic signaling like GLP-1, it stimulates PYY, it helps control blood sugar. There's so many things that these bitter receptors do that are so important, and these bitter compounds are basically found in plant-based foods. So all the people that push this whole carnivore agenda and all that, to me, it's such a it's such an activist thing. It's not really based on science, because what the science clearly shows is we need a big variety of food, right? We need lots of plant-based foods. We need lean meats. We need proteins. We need all of it. So the first thing people should be doing as they're trying to diversify their microbiome is to try to diversify your diet, right? Now, with kids who are on the spectrum, I know it can be tough because there's a lot of food aversions, there's texture issues, right? There's picky eating and all that. But the best thing you can do in that case is you just try your best to include new forms of foods into their system. You may want to enact a process of stealth nutrition. I don't know if you've heard the saying before, but I work with a friend of mine who's a nutritionist that specializes in autism and autism related nutrition. And the concept around stealth nutrition is about hiding nutritious things into types of foods that they normally would eat, right? And you have to get a little creative about it, but it can absolutely be done, right? So you have to work through it, and parents who are working with their kids who are on the spectrum are so dedicated to the kids, so they will find ways to do it. And there's lots of resources out there if you just look up stealth nutrition, right? There's ways of doing it. So increasing the diversity of the diet is so critical in increasing the diversity of the microbiome. What else can you do then? Well, you want to get outside as much as you can into natural environments like the dirt, the soil, going for walks and hikes in the woods and the parks and areas like that. And you don't want to sterilize your hands when your kids and the kid's hands when he or she are playing in the dirt and playing at the in the trails in the woods, or if you're near the coast, if you go to the beach, right? You don't need to sterilize the hand. I see far too often what parents do is like the kids are playing and they're picking up sticks and rocks and running and falling in the dirt and all that, and then before they sit down and eat like an apple or a sandwich, they're putting hand sanitizer on them, right? That's the antithesis of what you should do, because you want those microbes, you want that environment getting exposed into your child's microbiome, because that will increase diversity within the microbiome, right? And then another very, very important thing, there's a couple important things, but let me emphasize this one. There are studies that show quite clearly that people that live within the same household have a heavy influence on each other's microbiomes. So parents who are so dedicated to their kids and are putting everything they can and do for their kids every single day, but aren't taking care of themselves, their negative microbiome will impact their kids' microbiomes in a very negative way. So all the things that you may look at doing to improve the microbiome of your kid, you should be doing the same thing for yourselves. The probiotics, prebiotics, diet, stealth nutrition, whatever it may be, doing it for yourself, because a microbiome is a community issue within the households, within the offices and all that people live in, right? So we all have kind of a microbiome cloud that we live under. And the last thing I will say about the diversity side is using certain types of probiotics and prebiotics. So the spore-based probiotics like Megaspore, we've published studies showing that when you add a spore-based probiotics, it can increase diversity by up to 30% in individuals in as little as 3 or 4 weeks. And why is that? Well, because these spores are really good at something called competitive exclusion. And that's the way microbes can compete with other microbes, dysfunctional microbes in particular. So these spores can actually identify the presence of dysfunctional microbes, sit next to them, and produce compounds that bring down their growth and bring down their levels, and at the same time produce compounds that increase the growth of beneficial bacteria. So they're kind of going in there and effectuating change, almost like the police of the gut, if you will, right? So adding that into a increasingly diversified diet, and then adding in prebiotics like oligosaccharides like you find in Megapre, also feed the keystone species and increase diversity, right? So if you do those few things we just mentioned, then your diversity will start going up within your microbiome, and that's the first thing you need to think about fixing in this whole cascade of a dysfunctional gut.
Krishnan, thank you so much for this. This is like incredible download and an overview of how microbiome can play a huge role, especially in autism community. Now I have one question, in fact, an observation. One of my clients had a son, has a son, and he was very much rigid with his eating and picky eating and food aversions. And we saw that by adding minute doses, like mini doses of Megaspore, actually helped improve his picky eating. Now, I really wondered about that because we're going in reverse. We're like, we couldn't expand the diet too much. We only eat French fries, so we couldn't go too high with it. But we started sprinkling spore, and lo and behold, he was able to start eating more foods. And that's how we were able to improve the diversity, at least. How does that work?
Yeah, there's actually more and more evidence for this, right? So some of the earliest evidence that looked at the influence of the microbiome on food choice and eating behaviors came in studying things like anorexia nervosa, bulimia, and so on, and binge eating disorders, right? What they found is that individuals that suffered with eating disorders like anorexia, like bulimia, like binge eating disorders, tended to produce far less short-chain fatty acids and tended to have far lower microbial diversities. And because of that low diversity and low production of short-chain fatty acids, it tended to influence their appetite, their regulation, and their food preferences. So that was correlative data that they said, okay, looking at people with eating issues and aversions to food and things like that, they seem to have a signature in their microbiome of low diversity, low short-chain fatty acids. And then there's further studies that were done looking at how the microbiome influences things like mood and hunger signals and satiety signals, looking at the gut-brain axis, right? And one of the there's two major pathways that impact this. Number one is if your gut is highly dysbiotic, you end up with leaky gut, and as a result of leaky gut, you get a lot of neurological inflammation, because leaky gut allows this migration of toxins across the lining of the gut. Those toxins start interacting with your enteric nervous system, which is this really complex neurological system in your GI tract that connects directly to your brain through the vagus nerve. So that inflammatory response in leaky gut causes a disruption in the communication between the gut and the brain, right? And there's a lot of metabolic signals that go back and forth between the gut and the brain, in part dealing with satiety or hunger or food preferences, or stimuli to response to smells and response to texture and taste and so on. So when you disrupt those signals, then the stimuli doesn't create the same digestive symptomology, right? So if you don't have a food aversion or picky eating or any sort of disorder related to eating, when you smell something savory, you start to salivate, right? And when you salivate, then it starts secreting digestive juices. All of that is a somatic response to prepare the body for receiving food, digesting it, and being able to assimilate the nutrients. But that is a gut-brain connection, right? It's your brain perceiving those stimuli, speaking to your gut. Your gut is then responding with things like gastric acids and increased saliva and so on. Imagine if your gut and brain are not talking properly, right? So that whole signaling system gets lost, and inflammation is a big problem with that. The second way in which this is influenced is that microbes can actually make compounds that cause certain cravings and cause certain preferences, right? And so these microbes are living in your gut and they're producing these compounds. They release them into your enteric nervous system. It can go up the vagus nerve into the central nervous system and affect how your brain perceives food and what you're looking for to eat. And so some bacteria produce these metabolic signals that cause preferences for foods. And you could have, for example, or yeast, right? Yeast will cause a preference for sugar. So if you've got an overabundance of yeast, that yeast wants you to eat sugar, so they're going to create neurotransmitters that make you crave sugar. So now you're eating just donuts and sweet things and nothing else sounds good to you, right? Because you're being trained and programmed by the microbes in your system. And so this combination of having a dysbiotic gut and the dysbiotic microbes, including yeast and molds, producing neurological compounds to make you crave the foods that they want. That's one mechanism. And then the second mechanism is that inflammation that disrupts the gut-brain communication. So now your gut and brain aren't effectively talking to each other, right? So then it's easy to develop food aversions and, alterations in satiety signals and all of that. So yes, there's absolutely evidence. Now, what you guys were doing with the child was perfect because of the strong picky eating and because of the strong food preferences, you cannot make a drastic change in his or her diet in a short amount of time, right? You have to baby step it. And like you said, you just add small amounts of the spores, the Megaspore, and you can do that. Any parent can pull the capsule apart, take small pinch of the powder and add it into any sort of soft food or liquid, right? And they would consume it. The child will never even really know it's there. But even that little amount can start shifting the microbiome just enough where you start seeing a change in behavior and outcome, right? And this goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, where it's really a balance issue. And even when you make small incremental changes in the balance, you'll start to see the results show up pretty quickly.
It's fantastic. I finally have a decent explanation from Kiran himself about why this stuff actually works. And I'm so excited because this can be game changing for a lot of parents who are struggling with all kinds of feeding issues and food aversions and texture sensitivities. You shift the gut, you can shift the brain and the behavior with it. I think that's profound.
And it's just important for the parents to know, because I hear this from parents. They go, he's just a picky eater, right? As if that's a feature that he's born with. That's not necessarily true. That's a result of his ecosystem. So you can actually change that. And you don't have to have your child be a picky eater. You can have your child being more exploratory with food and so on.
Kiran, the question I also get is, because we know that our kids struggle with a few things. There is SIBO, there is SIBO, there is mold, there's yeast overgrowth. And how do we go about sequencing it? Because you talked about the gut diversity. Gut diversity would have these obstacles in the path of the parents who are trying to improve the gut health of their children. And these factors play a role for the leaky gut as well. I've heard you say before that when there is yeast involved, go after the yeast first. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that in context of autism.
Yeah, so normally yeast is a signal that there's significant dysbiosis because most of the yeast in your system are going to be opportunistic. So they grow and overgrow really, because they're always there. You always have yeast in your system, but they overgrow as a result of microbial dysbiosis in the system, right? So one of the first ways you can go after the yeast is to try to increase diversity in the gut microbiome. That in itself may control the yeast. Now you can, of course, go after the yeast with, probiotics, or even, harsher treatments like using undecyclinic acid and so on. But I would first use a combination of dietary changes to increase diversity, reducing sugar, right? Because the yeast do really well with sugar, and then using a probiotic like the Restore Flora, because the Restore Flora contains a probiotic yeast called Saccharomyces boulardii. And Saccharomyces boulardii does a phenomenal job of competing with and reducing the growth of other yeast, right? So if somebody has yeast overgrowth, it's a good signal that they're severely dysbiotic. So you want to increase diversity, you want to reduce the sugar intake, you want to stop feeding the yeast, and then using something like Restore Flora with an increase in diversity in diet, you can make a profound effect on the yeast.
So how do we decide between Megaspore and Restore Flora? I mean, usually, yes, yeast overgrowth, Restore Flora is a product of choice. When to know that we can now switch to maybe something like Megaspore? It certainly has more strains than Restore Flora.
Yeah, I would say with most kids who are on the spectrum, they're gonna already have very significant dysbiosis. So I actually don't see a reason why you wouldn't use both right from the beginning, right? So to give you an example, we developed something called the antibiotic protocol, and we had done a study on this where we showed that if somebody's gut was severely dysbiotic because of a course of antibiotics, one of the ways we could really enhance the gut and bring it back was to do Megaspore, Restore Flora, and HU58 every day, right? For something like 3 or 4 weeks, right? So HU58 is a standalone Bacillus subtilis product, right? So with any kids though, you want to go slow, so you want to taper the dose up, but there's no reason why you cannot use Megaspore and Restore Flora with children to get both of the benefits. And then I would say after about 8 weeks or 12 weeks, and you're seeing a significant change, you can just shift to just Megaspore for their maintenance, right? So Megaspore is kind of a long-term maintenance. You can use it all the time, but you don't necessarily need Restore Flora for that long, which Restore Flora is really good at going in there and tackling the dysbiosis that may or may not include yeast. Even if it doesn't include yeast, it's still really strong at tackling dysbiosis. In fact, the reason we developed that product was we had a request from a large distributor of products to nursing homes, and adults in nursing homes end up with a lot of C. diff and other dysbiotic infections because of the amount of antibiotics they use. So that's why we developed Restore Flora. So most kids with spectrum disorders are going to have a disrupted microbiome, so use both.
Use both. Sounds amazing. That sounds like a mini protocol to start with. Okay, so while we're on this subject, very quickly, I want to touch on the question of ferments and, the bone broths and things like that, especially the ferments, because we understand that they don't necessarily colonize the gut, and they will pass through, and they may temporarily improve, the gut diversity, but it's not going to last. I see parents going wild with the ferments and the different types of fermentation doing. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but then, we can get into all kinds of stuff with histamine intolerance and things like that. What are your thoughts about that with the ferments?
I think of ferments generally as potential food for beneficial bacteria in the gut, right? So if your child will tolerate it and you found a type of ferment you can make that the child seems to enjoy, then okay, it's fine. But it does not replace probiotics and prebiotics and other dietary interventions, right? That's where I normally push back on it, is that I'll hear people say, oh, I don't need probiotics because I use fermented foods. I use ferments. Ferments are not a source of probiotics, because those bacteria that did the fermentation will die in your stomach, and they won't necessarily make it to the intestines alive to create any change. The benefit of a ferment is the fermentation component of it and all the new compounds that have been created during the fermentation. So think of it as a nutrient source, but it's not necessarily the active thing that's going to be fixing the dysbiosis and so on. So, if you're going to do ferments, fine, as long as you found one that your kid tolerates and doesn't have negative effects, because you mentioned histamine and other issues that some ferments can have, right? And can flare people up and increase inflammation and so on. So let's assume you found one and you make a ferment that your child likes and works well with their system. Great, but it does not replace the need for probiotics and prebiotics.
Sounds amazing. So we're getting towards the end of this discussion here, and I don't want to leave it hanging without touching on prebiotics. So in the autism community, you probably are more aware of it than even I am, those the protocol mentalities, like, do this type of protocol, that type of protocol, and they mainly start with the different types of prebiotics. Inulin being quite popular in the autism community, see a lot of parents getting started with like, oh, we're doing inulin, and now we are seeing our kids be more aggressive. What is your take on, or rather your explanation about the sequencing? So I know you touched on probiotic. Where does prebiotic sit on that spectrum?
Yeah, so we created something in Microbiome Labs called Total Gut Restoration, right? And the Total Gut Restoration is a protocol of revamping and changing and restoring your microbiome and the function of your gut in general. So in that Total Gut Restoration, the sequence we do is probiotics first for the first 30 days, and then we don't introduce prebiotics until after 30 days. And then finally, we have this mucosal product. And we call that, it's called restore, reinforce, and then rebuild. And the idea behind it is that in order for the prebiotic to be properly utilized by your microbiome, you have to have the right organisms that are prevalent to utilize the prebiotics, right? Because remember, prebiotics by themselves don't do anything in the gut. They have to be metabolized properly by the right microbes to get the benefits out of them, right? And so you have to have the right microbes there in adequate amounts to get the benefit of the prebiotic. If you have dysfunctional microbes, depending on the prebiotic you use, you might be able to feed some of the dysfunctional microbes with the prebiotic, right? So if a child's gut is completely disrupted and has really high pathobionts and so on, and then you start feeding it prebiotics, you could be feeding the bad bacteria even more, right? And then the bad bacteria will convert it into problematic compounds rather than beneficial compounds, and you can be seeing that as a response to taking the prebiotic. So I have always talked about needing to reestablish the microbiome before you start feeding it, right? And feeding it with this growth driver, which is prebiotics. So you want to get a better, more functional microbiome, and then enhance that microbiome or reinforce that microbiome with the prebiotics. So I would do a minimum of 30 days of corrective probiotics like Megaspore, Restore Flora, and so on before you introduce prebiotics.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. And thanks for outlining the sequence for us. We're also seeing great results with Mega IgG. And I know that you mentioned that, it's great as a binder for endotoxins as well, and for mold, like a very gentle binder. To use that for the mold protocols too. Can you expand a little bit on it? And I promise this is the last question.
Yeah, no worries at all. Happy to talk about it. So IgG are immunoglobulins. Immunoglobulins are proteins that are made by your immune system, and these immunoglobulins are highly specific for certain antigens. Antigens are things that your immune system can recognize and bind and or neutralize and so on. And so these immunoglobulins can recognize things like toxins and viral particles and bacteria and bacterial toxins, even environmental toxins, bind them, neutralize them, and remove them from the system through defecation. It's a intelligent, specific binder that's different than things like charcoal or diatomaceous earth and so on, because those other types of general binders just grab everything and take it out. Good stuff, bad stuff, and so on, right? So they can have a negative effect in some cases as well. So what we want is this intelligent binder that not only seems to reduce the toxicity and toxic burden in the gut and in the body in general, it seems to also modulate immune response, because there are studies around reducing inflammatory responses. And kids on the spectrum have all kinds of inflammatory responses in their gut all the time, right? So it becomes a really, really great addition, a really great companion to the other things that you're doing to try to improve the gut as well. It just brings down the toxigenic load, thereby alleviating some of that load from the microbiome, from the liver, and so on.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Kiran, for explaining the role of these products as well as the microbiome and how it can actually help. I think we've had some really good key takeaways. I just wanted to thank you for taking this time to go over such minute details. And I think I will have to bring you back in again.
So much to cover. So yes.
So much to talk about when it comes down to autism. I mean, I want to get into eczema, I want to get into histamine intolerance, I want to get into the detox pathways, and what's your take on how detox can sit in the sequence. And I find parents all the time going after detoxes first and these binders and sprays instead of first restoring the gut microbiome, which we know is impacted. I want to bring you back to talk about one of your stool tests as well, and the gut scoring with that. So we'll leave that for next time, because I wanted this to be a good introduction and an orientation to Microbiome Lab products and to you actually. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.